This material explores the intersection of wealth and status, arguing that ethical wealth creation is a positive sum game, while status is a zero-sum game of perception. So a key theme running through this material seems to be that wealth manufactures abundance, whereas status is this ancient hierarchical struggle dating back to our days in monkey tribes.
Right.
But looking closely at the draft, I really have to push back on how it handles the initial clash between these two worldviews. I mean, it notes that journalists or virtue signalers attack wealth creators, but it completely skips over why they attack, just sort of presenting the hostility as an unexamined fact.
The material's examination of the conflict between wealth creators and status seekers can be deepened by explicitly applying the mechanics of perception to explain this friction.
Yeah, because right now it's just stating the symptoms.
Precisely. The weakness here is that the draft notes the hostility, observing that people attack wealth creators to boost their own status, but it treats this as a mere factual occurrence. It completely ignores the underlying cognitive mechanism driving the hostile behavior.
Right, it tells the reader what is happening on the surface, but it totally bypasses the why.
Exactly. And without understanding the mechanics of that why, the reader's just left with a very two-dimensional view of human behavior. I mean, they might walk away assuming these attackers are simply acting out of inherent malice, right? Rather than functioning within a completely different, internally consistent logical framework.
I can see what you're going for there. Like, if we just leave it at people are malicious, the text reads more like like a complaint rather than an insightful guide.
Yeah.
So, how should the author actually unpack the root cause of these attacks?
Well, the suggestion here is to integrate the psychological principle that perception controls emotions, and emotions control behavior. We have to explicitly show the reader those internal mechanics.
Okay, so breaking down the actual psychological steps.
Right. If a status seeker genuinely perceives wealth creation as a zero-sum game, meaning their fundamental lens on the world is that wealth is a fixed pie, then someone else having a larger slice inherently means their own slice is shrinking.
Which naturally leads to a specific emotional reaction.
Exactly. Their emotional response will naturally and quite logically be envy or anger, and anger predictably drives hostile behavior.
It's essentially like watching two people play a board game, but one player thinks they're playing checkers and the other thinks they're playing chess.
That's a great way to look at it.
To the chess player, the other person's moves seem wildly aggressive, illogical, and just rule-breaking. But the checkers player is acting entirely logically based on the specific game they perceive they are playing.
Yes.
If the author can explain that, the attacks no longer look like random malice, right? They look like a predictable outcome of a faulty premise.
That is exactly the dynamic at play. To make this actionable for the author, they need to provide the reader with a concrete way to visualize this. So, one concrete example for improvement is to introduce an other people's views, or OPV.
Just OPV, okay.
But rather than presenting it like some dry academic worksheet, the author can weave this into the prose using a narrative vignette.
Walk me through what that narrative vignette would actually look like on the page.
Sure. The author could write a short scenario mapping out the logic bubble of the status seeker. Imagine a scene where a status-focused individual wakes up, looks at their fixed income bank account, and then reads a news headline about a tech founder making millions from a new software platform.
Oh, I see.
The author should walk the reader through that character's internal monologue. Show the reader how, inside that specific logic bubble, the feeling of theft feels entirely real.
Because if you believe the pie is fixed, the tech founder didn't create millions. They must have hoarded it from someone else.
Exactly. Inside that logic bubble, writing a scathing hit piece or doing some virtuosic social media takedown makes perfect sense from their faulty starting perception. Of course, keep in mind that these suggestions are just a few out of all possible ways of solving the problem.
That adds so much depth, though. Instead of just dismissing the critic as a hater, the text explicitly contrasts the faulty perception, that visceral, emotional belief that making money is theft, against the actual reality of the situation.
Which is what?
Well, the reality that ethical wealth creation leverages code or media to manufacture new abundance out of thin air.
Precisely. By contrasting those two perceptions directly through a vignette, the author equips the reader to deeply understand the emotional mechanics of the attacks they will inevitably face on their own journey.
It shifts the reader from feeling victimized by critics to feeling analytical about them.
Right.
The overarching goal is simply to bridge the gap between the attacker's hidden perception and their very public behavior.
Okay, so as I understand it from the notes, once a reader actually breaks out of that zero-sum status mindset, the natural next step in the manuscript is transitioning into the active pursuit of wealth.
Yes, that's the progression.
And the argument here is that this requires acquiring specific knowledge and leverage. The draft emphasizes that you cannot just mimic the desires of the crowd or copy others.
Right.
But I want to push back on the author's execution here. If a reader simply uses standard, conventional logic to deduce what their specific knowledge and leverage should be, aren't they going to end up in the exact same boxes as everyone else?
Yeah, that's a huge issue.
I mean, if everyone logically concludes that artificial intelligence is the highest leverage field, we just end up with a million identical AI developers competing in a saturated market.
The practical advice on acquiring specific knowledge and product leverage could be significantly elevated by framing targeted perception as the foundational tool for identifying these elements.
Let's pull that apart a bit. Why is the reliance on standard logic such a glaring flaw in this section of the draft?
Well, the weakness is that the manuscript currently treats the acquisition of leverage, things like learning to code, utilizing capital or building media, and the discovery of specific knowledge as objective realities.
Like they can just be logically deduced by looking at a market chart?
Exactly. It treats them like items on a grocery list. This completely ignores the reality that logic cannot function properly if the initial perception is flawed, narrow, or overly influenced by societal trends.
Because logic just processes whatever you feed it.
Right. Logic is an enclosing system. It only processes the inputs you provide. If you feed your logic the exact same societal inputs and trends as everyone else, your flawless logic will inevitably lead you to the exact same saturated, highly competitive conclusions as the crowd.
It's like trying to find a hidden, undiscovered room in a house using the exact same standard blueprint that everyone else in the neighborhood was given.
That's a great analogy.
Like your logic in reading the blueprint might be flawless, your navigation might be perfect, but the blueprint itself is completely conventional. You are logically guaranteeing that you will only find what everyone else has already found.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize the trap. Therefore, my suggestion is for the author to argue that achieving what the text calls type 4 luck, that unique state where incredible opportunities seem to deterministically find you, requires a highly refined, deliberately directed perception.
Rather than just passive logical processing.
Exactly. Identifying one's genuinely unique, specific knowledge means actively building tools to look where no one else is currently looking.
The challenge there, though, is that we are all trained in standard logic from, like, elementary school, but no one is trained in directed perception. How does the author guide the reader to actually execute that on the page?
The author needs to introduce formal attention-directing frameworks to help the reader escape standard logic. A concrete example would be teaching the reader to use a plus-minus interesting, or PMI tool, to evaluate different forms of leverage.
How does that work in practice?
Let me break down how the author could explain this. Normally, when evaluating a tool, our standard logic just asks, is this good or bad? That is a binary judgment. But a PMI tool forces the reader to deliberately direct their attention to 3 distinct areas.
So they would literally list out what is a plus, what is a minus, and crucially, what is merely interesting about a specific form of leverage.
Right. The author could demonstrate this by comparing 2 different assets. Take writing software code versus buying a luxury Rolex watch.
Okay.
The plus of code is that it replicates infinitely with 0 marginal cost. The minus is that it requires a massive upfront time investment to learn.
And the interesting part.
The interesting aspect, which standard logic usually misses, is that code divorces your earning potential from your physical time.
Wow, yeah.
Then apply the PMI to the Rolex. The plus might be that it signals success. The minus is that it is expensive. But the interesting aspect is that the watch only retains its signaling value if other people cannot have it.
Oh, I see. By formally directing attention this way, the reader organically discovers the profound difference between positive-sum leverage and zero-sum status symbols.
Exactly. And again, keep in mind that these suggestions are just a few out of all possible ways of solving the problem.
That's a really powerful exercise for external leverage. But what about internal leverage, like the specific knowledge the author talks about, the stuff that feels like play to you but looks like work to others? How do you formalize the discovery of that?
The author could offer another concrete tool, perhaps a north, south, east, west style perceptual framework.
North, south, east, west?
Yeah, the author could explicitly instruct the reader to map out their innate childhood curiosities directionally. Look north to what your parents praised you for. Look south to what you got in trouble for doing too much of.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Look east to the obscure internet forums you browse on a Saturday night, and look west to the topics you naturally explain to your friends without realizing you're lecturing them.
That's great. It forces the reader to actively scan outside of what current society values.
Exactly. It bypasses conventional logic entirely to uncover their true, uncopyable specific knowledge. Obviously, whether they use this directional quadrant method or the PMI exercise, the mechanics are flexible. The ultimate objective is simply providing the reader with a tangible mechanism to see beyond the obvious.
Right, so a reader uses these perceptual tools to find their unique leverage and their specific knowledge. But that brings us to the execution phase.
The long-term game.
Exactly. Let's look closely at the section discussing execution, specifically playing long-term games with long-term people. The manuscript leans heavily into the idea of leveraging compound interest over decades to build massive wealth.
Yes.
But the author brings up this fascinating evolutionary reality. Humanity is descended from pessimists. The ancestors who assumed the rustling in the bushes was a tiger ran away and survived, while the optimists who assumed it was just the wind got eaten.
It's a strong biological baseline.
Right. So if we are genetically hardwired for short-term pessimistic survival, I have to challenge the draft's assumption here. The author writes as if a reader can just choose to become a rational optimist. Can they really do that without fundamentally changing how their brain processes information?
The argument advocating for long-term wealth creation can achieve greater resonance by emphasizing the role of rational optimism in shifting from a mindset of judgment to one of design.
Let's dig into the weakness in the text as it stands right now. Why is the current framing insufficient? The weakness is that the current text frames the transition to long-term wealth creation merely as a choice of which game to play. It's presented almost like deciding to play tennis instead of basketball. You know, you just pick up a different ball and walk onto a different court.
Which sounds way too easy.
Right. It does not adequately address the profound cognitive shift required to overcome humanity's deep-seated evolutionary bias toward pessimism and short-term thinking.
Because we're fighting our own biology.
Exactly. You cannot simply tell a biological machine that has been optimized over millions of years to avoid immediate danger to suddenly embrace decades-long optimistic compounding. The brain will actively fight that transition.
It reminds me of the difference between being a building inspector and an architect.
Oh, tell me more. Well, the inspector's entire job is rooted in judgment, walking through a structure looking for flaws, searching for code violations, finding every possible reason why the building might collapse. It is a highly analytic, pessimistic, and honestly, a necessary survival skill.
Yes, absolutely.
But you can't build a skyscraper with an inspector's mindset. You need the architect, who is fundamentally focused on design, visualizing what doesn't exist yet, and figuring out how to systematically construct it.
That's a perfect framing.
But I do want to push back on my own analogy for a second. Doesn't an architect still need that pessimistic inspector? I mean, if wealth creation involves massive leverage, and leverage amplifies risk, doesn't a rational optimist actually need a healthy dose of pessimistic judgment to avoid total ruin?
That is a brilliant pushback, and you are entirely correct. The architect absolutely needs the inspector, but not during the blueprint phase.
Ah, the timing is the issue.
Yes, the problem with our evolutionary wiring is that we apply the inspector's judgment prematurely. We shoot down the idea before the foundation is even poured.
I see.
The suggestion I have for the author is to synthesize the concept of partnering with rational optimists with the conscious cognitive shift from mere judgment to design. Judgment focuses on what is and uses standard logic to spot flaws. Design focuses on what could be and uses targeted perception to build value.
So the author needs to show the reader how to quarantine their pessimistic judgment so that design actually has room to breathe.
Precisely.
How does the author put that abstract cognitive shift onto the page, though? What is a concrete example of managing that pessimism?
The author could explicitly highlight how a status player relies on pure, premature judgment. To do this, they could introduce the concept of BOCTOE.
BOCTOE?
It stands for, but of course there are obvious exceptions. Status players and hyper-pessimists use this critical, nitpicking mindset to tear down new ideas.
Oh, I've met these people.
Right? If someone suggests a new business model, the pessimist immediately says, but of course there are obvious exceptions, what about this edge case? They do this because finding the flaw feels safe. It proves they are smart and protects them from the metaphorical tiger in the bushes.
Right. It's literally the easiest way to sound intelligent in a meeting without actually contributing any value whatsoever. You just find the one scenario where the idea fails and focus entirely on that.
Exactly. So, in contrast, the text could demonstrate how a wealth creator uses the mental operation of movement. This is a concrete tool for the reader.
How does movement work?
Instead of looking at an embryonic idea and asking, is this perfectly correct right now? The rational optimist uses movement and asks, where does this idea move us? What is the core value here that we can extract and build upon?
So they use rational optimism to navigate the risks, deliberately moving past the initial flaws to see if the concept has long-term structural integrity.
Yes, they design the skyscraper first and only call in the inspector later. And again, keep in mind that these suggestions are just a few out of all possible ways of solving the problem.
Are there other areas where this design mindset applies?
Definitely. Another concrete example could be applied to how the author discusses long-term relationships. The draft talks about playing long-term games with long-term people. The author could illustrate this using the flowscape concept.
Flowscape?
Yeah, instead of just networking, which is often a short-term zero-sum transaction, a flowscape maps how goodwill naturally flows from one positive interaction to the next over time.
So it's more organic.
Right. The author could show how compounding trust isn't just about sticking around. It's about actively designing an ecosystem where value naturally flows between rational optimists, building a robust network that generates wealth over decades.
That's fascinating.
These specific mental models are naturally just a handful of pathways the author might take to address the issue. The key is to provide the reader with a practical mechanism to override their biological pessimism so they don't run away from the rustling bushes of opportunity.
This has been an incredibly insightful dive into the mechanics of this manuscript. To summarize our critique, we've identified 3 core actionable takeaways for the author to fundamentally elevate this material.
Let's hear them.
First, map the logic bubble of status seekers using narrative OPV tools to help the reader truly understand the emotional mechanics driving zero-sum behavior.
Right.
Second, apply formal attention directing tools like the PMI framework or directional mapping to help readers bypass conventional logic and discover their untraditional specific leverage.
Exactly.
And third, address the massive evolutionary hurdle of pessimism by teaching the reader to consciously adopt a design mindset over a judgment mindset, utilizing concepts like movement to keep ideas alive.
Spot on.
We warmly invite the author to implement these cognitive shifts and submit the revised draft back to us for more feedback. We'd love to see where it goes. Thanks for tuning into this critique.